Justin Poulin here from Power Supply, and I'm back with Suzi Collins, but we've got another special guest. And what many of you may not realize is Brian Bartel is the man behind the newsletter for Power Supply. He's been providing a lot of support to the team, also is integral in our process to bring you podcasts that are approved for continuing education credits for your ARMS certification. So Brian, I do want to welcome you to our video series with Suzi. And today we're going to be talking about inventory turns. And Suzi's been dying to talk about this. So she said, hey, can we invite Brian to come talk about this with us? So welcome to your very first video. I know you've done some podcasts, but now we've got you on camera.
Perfect. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So Suzi, why don't you tee this up? Because I know that a lot of the topics that we've brought up are either ones that are hot topics in the industry or pain points for anybody out there. And I know a lot of the content that you create, we're trying to really reach a lot of different levels. And so if anybody's following you on TikTok or LinkedIn, they're going to see content from you that's really about day-to-day frontline folks working in materials or logistics. And so what is it about inventory turns that really, kind of lights your fire for conversation?
One, I don't like math. So that immediately, no, I think it's that I feel like it's very obscure. So when I was with Stanley Black & Decker, it was very clear that if you had this many widgets, you could build this many tape measures, right? And my brain understood the concept of having a certain number of widgets in order to fulfill that without having too many, right? My brain understands that. It's never really understood how we do really carry that into healthcare when I have everything from a piece of gauze that might be 4 cents to an Impella that's $25,000. So when you're doing math, right, how do you really look at that such a big disparity, if you will, between cost of products that are in a hospital? So I'm super excited to hear Brian talk about this because I know he's an expert.
All right. So Brian, why don't you first, when we talk about the concept of inventory turns, in case there's anybody out there who's not really familiar with it, and I think, Suzi, you did a good job of especially laying that out in terms of like all industries, right? Like this is how these products get assembled and then come in. But Brian, can you put some more framing around inventory turns and maybe how that impacts what you're doing in your role day to day?
Definitely. And I'll start with, appreciate that, Suzi, but by no means an expert on any of this. And kind of the old adage, if you've seen one hospital, you've seen one hospital, right? We've all heard that multiple times. And Suzi, you're 100% right. I mean, you've got these items that are very low cost, that are high turns. And then you've got these things like you mentioned, the Impella. I mean, that can be a huge increase in inventory. But when I think about inventory turns, it's basically a function of how efficiently you're using your inventory. I do agree with you in manufacturing and retail. It's a much different environment than what we have in healthcare. We do have to have supplies that we keep on hand in case that one patient walks in. Again, I have conversations with my staff all the time. If I'm on the table, if my family's on the table, if your family's on the table, we want to make sure that what we have is adequate. So when you're asked those questions, and again, I work for organizations that days on hand is another one that they continuously focus on. What they're really looking for is just some sort of a metric to measure how efficient you are with your inventory. And as we saw over the last couple of years with COVID, unfortunately, that skewed a ton. I mean, we started using, when we had to calculate burn rates, how many masks are we using, how many respirators, N95s. That completely just took everything that we had as far as historical data and turned it on its head. And so, but the other thing too, Suzi, and it depends on the hospital that you're at. Sometimes I've been asked to look at inventory turns and days on hand for the entire hospital. And while you can do that, typically a hospital will only do physical annual inventory. We're doing ours actually next Friday on the 29th. So I'm super excited. It's like Christmas for supply chain, right?
You're getting all prepped
That's right,
up. That's
right.
Great, Brian.
I'm a month away.
So I'll tell you, that inventory, nobody loves that
That's
one.
right.
So.
Yeah,
but you're right. That data is important, right, Brian? Yep. Like if you don't have an accurate reflection of inventory, how can you do these calculations
Correct.
and actually have any meaning behind them?
Yep. And so I know some facilities will have different, like a perpetual inventory throughout the system where it's a scan in, scan out. I have not had the opportunity to work in a system like that. And so when I have conversations with the CFO or the finance team, I try to focus on what we have in our perpetual inventory, because that's much easier to track. We're doing month-end reporting, and that is something that we have direct influence over.
Yeah. And I think that that's where I definitely can do turns out of my warehouse because it is perpetual and I can look at that. But when they start to tell me my inventory turns overall in the hospital aren't appropriate, it makes it so much harder. I almost feel like there has to be an ABC of inventory turns and categorize the products versus trying to do it with one lump sum.
So, Suzi, can I ask you a question on that? Are you saying that the metric is just global regardless of product? Like this is where they want to see inventory turns for every SKU and they don't treat them differently?
It's generally one number, one typical number. And really it's even driven not even just by the hospital. They'll look at healthcare as a whole. So they're looking at J&J, they're looking at Stryker. So it's just, that's what I've always struggled with when I feel like I do a very good job with my inventory and we maintain par levels. To hear that there's something up with my turns, I can never really quantify it.
What about creating some redundancy in the supply chain now, right? Like we used to do it where you're really trying to have one product and you're trying to get discounts because you're utilizing one. But now with back orders, there's a lot of redundancy. There's alternatives that have to be identified. Does that also skew some of that metric because of just the way that the back orders impact the rates of the turnover that you're having on this particular product in that mix?
I don't think so. And I'll let Brian speak to that too, because again, it comes down to math. So it could skew it if you're paying more for what your back, your normal product is back ordered and now I'm paying more for my sub, right? So in a way, yes, that could skew it when you're looking at it from a pure math standpoint. But from, even that though, in the warehouse, again, I would bring that product in under my normal number. But in the operating room, I've just never had a good feel for the way to really know that we're turning things the way we need to, and it's readily available for a patient on the table. That's the answer I want.
Brian, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I'm completely there with you, Suzi, especially when you're doing annual inventory. I mean, luckily on a one-time basis, we don't have to do annual inventory every single month, right? And that's one thing that I've also struggled with, because to your point, we like actionable data, and even running it on a monthly basis out of a perpetual, you probably feel like you're always a little bit behind the ball, right? So imagine that on an annual scale. And so when you're talking with finance, sometimes that's what they're looking at, because they are, inventory turnover ratio is the average inventory. So you'll take the beginning plus the ending inventory, you divide that by 2, and then you're going to divide that by cost of goods sold. And so we really need something that's more up to date. Otherwise, if you work somewhere for 3 years, you've only had really kind of 3 shots to prove yourself. And that can, vary widely. So maybe there's a way, Suzi, and we could talk about this, to work with finance to have, I know that they update inventory on the books every month. Maybe that's something that we could get with our teams and just try to figure out if it even makes sense. But again, it's one metric. And again, I go back through our perpetual inventory, probably similar to what you're doing, Suzi, is we track inventory turns, we track days on hand. But the other thing we haven't talked about too is really important, and that's your fill rate. How many out of stocks have you had in that? Because we could pump up the turns, but at that risk, you're being super efficient. You run the risk of running out of stock. And then the other thing too we want to look at is slow and non-moving items. So you've got that bucket of things down at the bottom that, maybe your clinical teams will say, oh yeah, we didn't even know we have that. You can get rid of it. Or they might say, we absolutely do have to have that. We understand it's going to expire. Hopefully we don't have that type of patient that comes in, but we do have to have it. So you've got to start measuring all of these different metrics to kind of give that overall picture. And finance, again, especially if it's, driven from the corporate level, they're really looking at what that target is. But you need to start having conversations with them about, well, why are you asking this? Let me show you some of the data that we have of why this, inventory turn is the way that it is. And then you can start talking about fill rates. We went from a 95 to a 98% fill rate. We've reduced our non-moving inventory, 10% or whatever it might be, and have that kind of data on the backside too to help with that.
Yeah, and I in my warehouse, I sit right around a 98% fill rate. I think when we go back to that conversation about the hospital or the operating room, what I'll do is I can run a report to see if we've brought that item in the last year. And I try to look at that before we count and then go have a conversation with the operating room and find out, okay, was some surgeon using this that's gone? We haven't purchased this for a year. So instead of counting it again, and especially risking counting it again with the same count as last year, we go ahead and try to see if we can move that somewhere within the hospital system. The other thing that we did a few years ago was the warehouse. I had almost 1,100 SKUs. And so there was a bunch of stuff that was like non-moving, but you can't just send a list out to clinicians. It doesn't work that way, partly because our descriptions in Lawson are terrible. So I had one of my employees go and pick one of everything on the list. And then we got a classroom and we laid everything out and we let people vote. And we got rid of about, I think, 100 SKUs just doing that.
Wow.
Because they're like, oh yeah, we don't need this anymore. But they were able to see it.
How did you tackle that,
you have to
Brian?
get creative.
Yeah, that was my question, was like that non-moving inventory. I imagined that was a daunting task, and it's something that, you have to operationalize and continue to do. And if you don't maintain it, it just continues to get out of control. And I wondered what's that best practice for cleaning that up. So that's that, but I'm sure everybody's doing it differently, right? So that, Suzi, I like how you did that. You just do a little bit at a time and kind of pull everybody in, and you really gave the clinicians an opportunity to have a lot of say in that. So when the decision's made, it's not like, hey, why did you do that without my input? I think that's a major key to success. Have you tackled it differently, Brian, or did you do something similar to what Suzi described?
We've definitely done something similar. Sometimes we'll invite departments down to the storeroom and just walk through, and same thing, they can put their eyes on it and be like, oh yeah, we didn't know that we had that, or yes, we absolutely need it. The other thing that we'll do too is look at where it was counted last. Sometimes, surprisingly, you'll find things that haven't been counted anywhere in the hospital. And so you've got something that's been sitting in your perpetual that has not even been purchased. It hasn't been used. It hasn't been inventoried outside of that. And so just looking at the data behind it too, it might just be something that's there. Again, we'll never, if it's something simple that, like a label or something that we know is not critical, we'll make the decision in supply chain to get rid of that. But if it has any clinical consideration that we're not sure of what that is, then we'll work with that clinical team to make sure that it's something that we can get rid of.
Do you prioritize products with an expiration in that case, or ones that have shorter expiration time frames?
We go through our storeroom and our PARs on a quarterly basis and check for outdates and make sure everything's clean and up to date, kind of what Suzi has talked about in her TikToks, which I really appreciate, Suzi, by the way. That's a really good indication. If something's expiring, then that's when we have that conversation too, and try to figure out, number one, we look at the data. Okay, well, this might reside in critical care because it's not a critical care product, but they do need one, but ER uses them all the time. And so then we'll transfer that stock down to ER so that it gets used up and bring them something newer. But yes, absolutely, expiration date does play into it. And unfortunately, we don't have a way to track when something is expensed as an out date. And so in the past, I've been at a facility where it goes to a different GL, so you can track that. So you can look back and be like, oh, well, even though it shows we used 10, it's because those 10 expired. So you're really dependent on your MMIS system on what it can tell you as well. Because again, usage could come from true usage, or it could come from an out of date situation too. So you got to be mindful of that.
The whole thing that we talked about earlier too is physician change. When you lose a physician, that's a big deal. And it's really important too that we get right on top of that and make sure that who's ever coming in, are they going to use the same product? If they're not going to use that product, do we feel like now's the time to let it, maybe go to a different site within our system? So physician changes is a really big element too.
And one other thing
that doesn't always come into play on inventory turns.
Definitely. And Suzi, one other thing that I would add too that's really important and critical, when you're having these conversations with finance, it's important to highlight the areas that you have under, your purview under supply chain versus those that are clinical owned. And I'll tell you, we've had so many good conversions of taking over the order of like lab, DI. We've got our foot in the door with OR. Start having those conversations that can manage supply chain. Let us do what we do best so that the clinical teams can work to the top of their licensure. We talk about that all the time. And it's amazing. At first they're like really hesitant. They're like, oh, well, you don't know what we use. And it's like, well, we're a data-driven organization. We'll definitely help. And so you look at what happens. I mean, we've done this with CVOR, and it's amazing. You go up there and you start realizing how much stuff is close dated, is out of stock. And again, it's somebody that from their perspective, they can't run out of it. They have to have it. Maybe they ran out once, and so they order 10 times more than they need. So by supply chain stepping in, that's another good thing. It's like, okay, well, if we have control of perpetual and a couple pars throughout, the med surg and CCU units, but we're not in the OR, we can't affect that overall inventory. We've got to be in the OR. We've got to be where those high dollar valuable items are, because that's where we're really going to start seeing a reduction and a greater efficiency through what we do. And so that's another good conversation point to have, is let supply chain do what we do best. If we don't have control over it, again, the perpetual inventory in a storeroom is probably significantly less than what's up in the OR.
That's really interesting. We could, the fact you tackled lab is impressive.
And start small.
That's the only place, lab and pharmacy is the only place I'm not.
And we've started small, and it's funny. So at first, we had to build out a separate little room that used to be an office. We started with phlebotomy supplies. And, the phlebotomist who's in charge of the lead, extremely good at what she did. I went up there and had her own kind of inventory system set up on a spreadsheet. So it made it easy for us. But I think they anticipated that we were going to fail. And now almost every week we've got them asking, hey, can you take on, microbiology? Can you take on this? That room is expanded into 3 rooms. And so that trust comes with performance as well.
That's awesome.
All right. Final thoughts. I know we are just scratching the surface, but I think honestly, this is a very actionable conversation. Lots of great recommendations and best practices that the two of you laid out for managing inventory turns. Although I still see that there's some areas of improvement. It's not just communicating with finance. I think there's a message here, about the nuances that need to be accounted for and explained for, and building that collaboration. So that may be a future conversation, is how do we collaborate with finance better, and some strategies around that. And to your point, Brian, here are some conversation points for clinicians and finance. Maybe we carve those out, but great discussion. Suzi, we'll start with you. Final thoughts before we wrap up.
No, I think this was awesome. It definitely makes me think about future conversations. Another big challenge is we may have spend, right? Because I've purchased the product, but we may not see that revenue for 6 weeks, right? So helping to explain to finance, we had 3 Impellas that month, or we had 3 really big revision cases. Helping people to know how to kind of dive into the data and keep track of it a little bit more, I think is super important. Not all, like in my previous experience, I had a finance person at my side. So he would just ask me questions. Now I'm the person who has to figure out what happened, right? So I think that just giving our audience more education about where to look for when they get asked about spend against revenue, how to help answer that.
And Brian, final thoughts from you. And I'm also kind of curious, you kept talking about revenue there, Suzi, and I feel like in supply chain, revenue wasn't something that you necessarily had a lot of responsibility for in the past. It was always about cost savings and getting those reductions. And I think that revenue conversation, as we've talked about several times, is coming more and more prevalent for anybody working at various levels within the supply chain. And so I know that those aren't necessarily new conversations, but they might be happening more often, and they may be getting more detailed as that shift is happening. So, Brian, your final thoughts, and then we'll wrap.
Yeah, I would just say that I think both of us would agree, all 3 of us would agree that there's increasing pressure when you look at reducing costs, increasing profitability where you can, whether you're not for profit or for profit. A lot of that comes down to asking the 5 whys. I mean, we talk about that quite a bit too. If they're asking for a metric, you need to start asking those questions. Well, what are you really trying to solve for? What is it you're really looking at? that's going to really help direct some of those conversations moving forward. There's so much opportunity out there. Again, I've had conversations with finance and realized that everything that we're purchasing under a non-stock hits that department expense the month that it's received. And so we've started bringing some of those high value, like you talk about Impellas, we bring those into our perpetual inventory system. So it's sitting on the balance sheet as an asset versus going out as an expense. Now, when they use it and we need to bring them up to the floor, then that expense hits. So having those conversations with finance of what they're really trying to do will drive those conversations in a much deeper and broader perspective that's beneficial for all parties involved.
That was a great nugget, Brian. All right. So, Suzi, looking forward to the next set of videos. Brian, we're definitely going to be having you back. Great conversation today. And you really closed it with some great insights there. I want to thank you both, and stay tuned. More videos coming from the Power Supply team in the future. And maybe we'll continue some of this discussion around finance and how to engage. Maybe inventory turns is not done. Maybe there's more to come. So thank you everybody for tuning in today.